which is, of course, such a hot topic right now. I was hoping we could talk about Apple, but I was told that they'd already covered it in the other panels this morning. But I didn't see it, I can never get enough of that topic, so I think we feel like we should feel free to talk about it. We have a very illustrious group of panelists. I think that all of you have the program and have seen the biography, so you know who everybody is. Alexis Wichowski on my right, Ashkan Soltani, and Joseph Cannataci here. So we have really all sectors represented: academia, the UN, the White House, private sector experience as well. And I think we'll be looking at the question of privacy really from sort of several angles. What are the different ways that we can sort of protect privacy while still reaping the benefits of big data? And really looking at that from multiple perspectives, private sector, government, policy, because we are at a policy school at SIPA. But I wanted to begin by a little bit defining, before we sort of go into full flight, what exactly do we mean by big data? When we're talking about that trade-off between sort of data collection or privacy, what kinds of data are we going to be talking about here today? I don't know who wants to take that first. I will give you yours.
Ladies first.
Thank you. I apologize in advance for losing my voice. I'm not contagious, but I may lose my voice a little bit here. So thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here and to meet both of you today. And I'm really glad you asked this question because before I started working for the U.S. government at the State Department and then came to teach at SIPA, I worked in web architecture and book indexing in the publishing industry. So I've gotten many years of thinking about information, both in analog and digital form. And one of the things that I've really been struck by over the last 2 decades is the way we talk about information and data and how we, especially with issues like privacy, we talk about something like a balance. How do you balance privacy versus security? And I feel that this metaphor, this representation is really not accurate anymore at all. Because it implies there's at some point a steady state, that there's a stillness where something can be perfectly calibrated. I think that when we talk about data, we're talking about more of kind of a swirling mass that we need to have lanes for and kind of resting places for and road signs for and maybe license plates for, but we're not really talking about anything that can be conceptualized as sort of on one scale of a balance versus people's rights on the other scale. So when I think about big data, I'm thinking about a very active, motion-driven kind of entity that we are trying to impose order on and understand. But I think that the speed and the movement need to be really brought into that mission of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really expanding. But I'm assuming for the purposes of this discussion that we'll be thinking about some kinds of data more than others, or not. Joseph?
Yeah, well, I think that you can't discuss big data without discussing another aspect of policy, and that's open data. And it's actually open data, I think, which has made all the difference. The United States has adopted, as a matter of national government policy, the policy of open data, which is making access open to as much publicly held data as possible. And it's not only the United States which is doing that. Europe has done the same thing. China has done the same thing in an even bigger way. So the point that we're discussing here, I think, is not big data analytics, which actually has been around with us for some time, for those of us who have been working in the data processing sector. It's taking big data analytics and seeing how you then marry those to a scenario where you have open data, which kind of makes all the safeguards we thought were safeguards in the 80s and 90s no longer safeguards. So in the 70s and 80s, we were discussing anonymization. But when you take big data together and link it to open data, then you realize that a lot of the old anonymization techniques are no longer working. So you lose out on privacy over there, which means we need to have a rethink. If not about big data, certainly about open data, because we need to then weigh the benefits we get from open data as against the losses we have to privacy. A number of scholars, especially United States scholars like Anya Schiffrin and others, have shown for more than 20 years now what you can do with big data and open data together. And it's precisely that. It's safeguarding medical records where we thought that they were safe, safeguarding loads of other private information which we thought was private, and which is suddenly de-anonymized thanks to putting big data and open data together.
Isn't it too late? I mean, is there actually any...
Is it ever too late? No, I don't think it's too late. The fact that we have had a number of things developing, including cyberspace, including internet and business models in cyberspace developing without a public policy discussion about the matter, doesn't mean it's too late. We've had loads of things happening over the past 2,000 to 7,000 years without a public policy discussion. But then, heck, we say, can we do something about it? If we can't do something about it, at least we're talking about it. 10 years ago, we were not necessarily doing so.
Ashkan?
So I do think there are things unique about big data that are somewhat different, and I think it has to do with our policy mechanisms and tools. Right? Most of our policy with regards to the governance of information, particularly sensitive or private information, in the US at least, is based on a consent model where consumers can opt in or choose to share particular types of information, or they can choose to opt out. And what makes it challenging, so my background is cognitive science, as undergrad I did kind of behavioral science side, and I've done some econ and security and other topics. But what to me is interesting about the big data side is how that impacts our decision making, right? So oftentimes there might be pieces of information that I might request from you that you, for example, not want to share with me, right? So I might ask about your sexual orientation or your health condition or other attributes which you might not knowingly want to share or disclose to someone else. But with a lot of the uses of modeling and big data inferences, you can do things like infer people's likelihood to be a particular orientation or based on their eating habits, particular health conditions, and it allows inferences that you would not otherwise disclose or not knowingly disclose. And so what that to me strikes is that, or raises is that the framework that we've operated under notice and choice, notice and consent, often breaks down in these environments where we cannot understand or comprehend the ways where our data might be used or might be used to make inferences about us that could be potentially sensitive or unknown to us. And so
it's hard to believe that consent is really consent.
Right. So meaningful consent has always been this key cornerstone of policymaking, and there's been tons of literature about how people, for example, don't know what they consent to, or don't read the consent, don't read the disclosures. But in this case, I'm talking about something slightly different, which is that even if they read and took the time to read the disclosures, could not necessarily comprehend the ways a large machine learning algorithm might make inferences about them, or it might be used in a larger ecosystem.
There's one follow-up point to that, which is, I think it's absolutely true that people don't really understand the inferences that can be made with the data that's collected about them. But I also wonder, when you say that is consent really an issue here, if people are willing to make that trade-off. So the convenience of having an iPhone in your pocket or an Android smartphone and all of your apps and access to your email and your contacts, etc., outweighs in many cases, it seems, the desire for privacy. I don't think that most people, especially post-Snowden, believe that all of their data is completely is handled well and managed in their best interests. But at the same time, people knowingly and voluntarily give up data about themselves all the time, even not trusting that it's going to be cared for. So there's the convenience of having the technological gadgets and goodies that we have. It puts us in a condition where we are giving up a lot of rights, even the ones we know about, let alone the ones, as you say, that machine algorithms.
They're just thinking, oh good, now Amazon can sell me better shoes. They're not thinking in 30 years I won't be able to get health insurance, right?
Right, this is the challenge with privacy harms in general, is that they're low probability events with potentially high probability impact in rare cases. So it might be 0.1 times a million as the harm in someone, and we're bad at that calculus in our head. Right? We're not good at trying to estimate what is the likelihood of this disclosure today causing me harm 30 years down the road, and when faced with that long-term horizon decision versus like do I want new shoes today, and do I want better? People often make that decision. This has been in a number of other domains, like health, like vaccinations, like seatbelts. Right? People are really bad at estimating what those harms could be, and so as a result, we're not really good at making those trade-offs up, even were we to understand them.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, just quickly, if I could agree with something and disagree with another. With Ashkan, when it comes to consent, I've been running a number of research projects in the field for the past several years, including with an expert set of cognitive psychologists and cognitive scientists, and the results seem to bear out what you're saying. In other words, people don't really know what they're consenting to. They, more than 80-85% of people in some cases don't read the privacy policies, and out of the ones that read them, only about 11% actually claim to understand. So the extent to which consent is actually a safeguard is not only doubtful, I think we should say it's out there. It's something which companies are relying upon as an explicit way to get sign-off, but is it a safeguard? And quite plainly the answer is no. When it comes to some other things on the way that we're tackling the way forward on the internet, then I think we have got to see what people are actually aware of. Because one of the problems that arises is that people are not aware of the way that their data is being used, even if they are consenting to anything. So with consent or without consent, there's a whole load of complicated processing and big data out there, which I'm with you, Ashkan, I say, people just don't understand it, and they don't understand how it could actually get back to, well, bite them in the butt.
Good. So now we've established, all right, so we've done a good job of establishing there's definitely a problem and that consent is not the solution. So now, the hard part, what then is the role of government and policymakers here in this situation, would you all say? Sorry, that was fun.
A long-served bureaucrat here. I worked in the State Department for several years, and so have thought a lot about the way that policy should be and then what actually is possible. I want to actually, for a second, cite a report that might not seem relevant, but I promise how connected. Last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a report that in the Journal of American Medicine that the longevity of the top 1% of males was something like 15 years higher than the longevity, than the lifespan of males in the poorest 1% in America. And the surprising finding in the study, that wasn't so surprising, was that geography had a massive role to play in this, in that in certain cities and certain locales, and not just big cities, there was really no difference in the lifespan between the richest and the poorest, because their conclusion was local interventions from governments, whether on the city level or the state level, and the community level, had a huge impact on the quality of life for the people who lived there. Now, so in terms of what can policy do, this is one of the great challenges of data, is that we have humans who reside in a certain place, and in that place give their information, whether knowingly or not, to a network. But we don't have the same sort of level of intervention that you can have in the physical space necessarily possible online. So I think one of the challenges of government is that for the most part, policymakers, I think, don't even consider anything like community or local level interventions because they don't really match up. So the point of this is to say, instead of thinking about having a one-size-fits-all solution for people to have their data protected, perhaps or for instance, in terms of service, people give their consent and they don't really get it, maybe it's to have some sort of outreach or targeting to different kinds of communities online. Those who are more aware and more interested in protecting their information, and then other people who maybe well-educated and do, for instance, shopping or other kinds of transactions online, but just don't get exactly how their information is being used. So I think government policymakers need to rethink how they approach the problem. I don't think there's any one policy for the entire population.
You're not suggesting different levels of privacy for different...
No, not at all. I'm talking about different levels of outreach. Different levels of outreach into different kinds of online populations. So for instance, there are, I'm sure we all know people who use Hotmail, AOL, maybe some people in this room. And there are other people who are the Gmail or Yahoo users or some other domain. We all have varying levels of internet savvy, both ourselves and the people that we know. And I'm sure it's not just people at a certain age or educational level who may be less internet savvy than others. So what I'm suggesting is that policymakers, it might be useful to not think of a one-size-fits-all approach, but think about, in terms of educating people, because consent, these kinds of services, as my colleagues here have just discussed, people aren't really necessarily understanding them or reading them. So the question is, how do we make sure people understand what's happening to the data that they provide? So perhaps that would be a policy solution.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that one of the issues too is that when we say policy, a lot of times people just think, okay, policymaker, and what do? They make laws. But it's not just law that we're talking about here. Of course, laws, or national laws, regional, international law can be useful and they have a role. But in some of the projects that we've carried out, for example, on behalf of the European Commission, part of the policy briefs we have come up with also speak of other alternatives. And education is a big one. I think that when a policymaker has got to decide as to how to intervene, if at all, because that, of course, is always one of the key questions. Should we intervene or should we not intervene? But one of the ways of intervening certainly is education. Put money into awareness campaigns, into education, in order that people can understand what the actual risks are out there. So in the same way as we've looked at sex education, why don't we look at privacy education? Why don't we look at other forms of education? Because that would actually possibly influence the way that people look at what they put online and how they behave online. And I think that's also a basic distinction that we have, which is not only what people put online, of that people, okay, I've posted this on Facebook, okay, this is some kind of form of user-generated content. But it's what happens in the metadata they create as they go around surfing online, clicking online. And what a lot of people are not necessarily aware of is particularly that. The way that they have become the product, the way that their data is being harvested, the ways in which that the harvested data is being used and can be used. And that is something which a lot of people are not aware of, and which people need to become aware of, and for which they would benefit from some kind of other safeguards, which is yet another policy decision. How do you incentivize companies, including software companies out there, to provide the right kind of technical safeguards which people could employ at will? And we've seen this come along quite a long way. If you look at some of the software companies out there, or some of the messaging apps we have, and we've seen an example with this with WhatsApp recently, people have become more privacy conscious. So to a certain extent, you now have a more, certainly more of an approach of not only privacy by design, but privacy by default. As far as I know, unless I got it wrong, it is now not possible to opt out of encryption in a WhatsApp transmission, communication. Are we going to see more of that? Is that the right kind of policy to have? Which turns us right back around to big data and open data. What should be the policies there which embed safeguards from the word go?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys have now persuaded me that reaching out to individuals or individual education would be a wholesale solution, right? It seems that embedding
it's only part of it.
is
I'm going to
what do you think?
I'm going to completely disagree. So the education we're potentially recommending is abstinence in this case, right?
No.
Because the market is so there's so little differentiation with regards to privacy and data collection in the marketplace, effectively allowing consumers to try to pick and choose which companies have better or worse security practice. As someone so my background, I did the Wall Street Journal's What They Know series. I worked at the FTC for about was their chief technologist most recently. I've been investigating companies and their practices. With regards to WhatsApp, for example, yes, it's encryption by default, but most people leave iCloud backups on by default. So if you use WhatsApp and you have what most people do, iCloud backups, you don't actually have encryption. Most people don't know and they don't understand these nuances. So so while I do think user education and choice for particular marketplaces would help if there is differentiation in the marketplace, if we have a world where companies have different practices. I also think finding ways to incentivize companies to do the right thing, to have more kind of fiduciary duty with regards to consumer data, I think or with regards to data in general, is an important factor. And we're seeing some forces kind of play themselves out in the sense of breach and the prevalence of breach of consumer data and the loss of trust, right? And so to the degree that companies feel any impact from losing or mishandling or misplacing consumer information, then perhaps there's an incentive. But otherwise, I think there needs to be potentially more incentives created for companies to do things like encrypt data, as you say, retention limits, right? So when we talk about data, most of the data breaches we've seen are data that's like 5 years old, 10 years old. Our data in the OPM breach was, up to like 10 or 15 years old. There's no reason why that data will have the same value. It might be valuable in some contexts, in which case you might try to encrypt the data or try to store it in ways it's not so readily, so it's not so potent when it gets breached. Or you might find perhaps there are other mechanisms like data deletion, data encryption, lack of collection that might help incentivize kind of lack of sharing.
I mean, presumably companies are just like credit card companies, right? Like they know even if there's a leak or it gets lost or misused, it's still cheaper to deal with that than to put in place all the safeguards, right?
I just wanted to make one clarification about the intention of I was not at all advocating abstinence of technology use. No. And I think we're looking at this from different perspectives. So I should clarify, when I worked at the State Department, I was in the public diplomacy office. So all of our work was about how do you get to citizens, get them to make decisions about what they want, what they don't want in terms of pressuring their own governments. Ideally, that would be what the US government policies were. So what I was suggesting is educating people about when you are about to post that photo, when you're about to send that email, think twice about who has access to that. How long Facebook, for instance, will keep that photo? Is it really safe? So it's about educating consumers about.
But to what end? The question
to what end is to make sure it's outside of complete abstinence from technology or trusting that technology companies will, as I said, manage your data safely. It's the one thing consumers can do to have some semblance of control over their data and retaining their privacy.
If I want to use the internet, if I want to shop online, educate me, how should I do it so that my data is, what company should I choose so the data is better handled?
Okay, so this is dated now, but what is HTTP versus HTTPS?
Sure, so the transport layer, but
very few people outside of this kind of environment 5 years ago would have ever thought to look for that little sign.
Right, and
so I think that's the kind of education I'm talking about, is being aware of what's a safe place, safe place to shop, what's a safe link to click on, etc.
But I guess what I was saying, I think I was proposing abstinent as a way to essentially highlight that regardless of whether you use HTTP or HTTPS, it's not clear whether your data will be any safer in the long run, right? So I might have HTTPS into a site that has very bad back-end data practices, right? Yes. And so other than me not engaging with the internet or sharing data, and it's not just, people often confuse this, they often think that it's only about the posting, sharing of information that causes harm. My primary concerns are things like passive collection by third parties or passive collection when you walk down the street for like retail location tracking, which I'm sure some people know. It collects Wi-Fi signals from your phone as you walk by. There are very few ways where consumers can actually meaningfully enact choice, even if they're well educated in the current marketplace. So until there's differentiation, so going back to cars, 30 years ago, you couldn't buy a safe car. You could be educated, but if you drove a Toyota or before Volvo, if you a GM, they would all have very similar crash test profile. So I could be educated, but I couldn't meaningfully enact choice, right? And so until there was incentives placed upon the car companies, both from a regulatory perspective as well as from competition perspective, only then do we see consumers being able to go and choose a Volvo and say, you know what, and other car companies compete on car safety. And I think that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about.
Could I sound an optimistic note on what has just been said? Because the interesting thing is actually that the market has been changing.
Absolutely.
And to put it in car terms, there are many more Volvo companies out there today in the IT world than there were 5 years ago. In fact, even today, it's interesting to see that we had a year, and for me, 2014 was the year of encryption. In 2015, going into 2016, we had a lot of discussion where a large US company like Apple was portraying itself as a champion of privacy. And I'm not saying it is, but I'll just remind people that not so many years ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago, people were screaming that Apple was taking data unknowingly in a way which was not compatible with privacy. If you look at the actions, at the way that companies have tried to differentiate themselves over the past 3 years, 4 years, all of a sudden, where before privacy couldn't buy you a single vote outside a few countries in Europe, all of a sudden it's being touted as something to have, as something that every phone should have, as something that software that you should be using for your communication should have. And where education comes in, I think, is also important, because the educated public, rather than going for abstinence, goes in for some other kind of life, which says, okay, so first of all, if I realize that a communication being encrypted is not the be-all and end-all of security, what do I do next? And all of a sudden, company A and company B offers me a phone which encrypts all the data on my phone in an effective way, and not just the transmission. I say, okay, then that's what I go for. And if you look at a lot of the companies out there, all of a sudden, privacy is much more of a differentiating factor.
That's right.
Which kind of encourages me.
Well, I agree. As long as the US government allows it.
Well, what I think you'll find is, if the US government doesn't allow it, you're going to get a whole load of people who are going to get their phones from elsewhere, or else, as happens in the US, as happens in other democracies, you're going to have a whole load of people saying, dear US government, this is just not on. We're not going to tolerate certain things, because in the same way as you've had legislation in the United States had to change. Why has legislation in the United States changed? Some people are saying it's not perfect yet, but since the Snowden revelations, you have had changes. And you have had changes for the better. And you have had changes which now outlaw certain kinds of interceptions. Is that a good change? Why did it happen? It happened because the media did their job, somebody else did their job, people decided, and quite frankly, the United States had a president who said, yeah, for the first time, it was the first time I heard a US president say, well, really, it could be that citizens outside the United States have a right to privacy too. They have some rights too. They're human beings too, after all. So it's not just 300 million United States citizens who have a right to privacy, but the rest of the world might have a right to privacy too. And perhaps we should put our money where our mouth is and do something about it.
As you look around the world, where do you see the leadership on this question?
Leadership on this question?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to
Companies,
let the other two go first.
Like, who's doing a good job, or who should we all be looking to and learning from? Any parts of the world, any governments, any companies, like any forum?
Okay, let me wade into that, shall I? And it's something which I included in my report to the United Nations on the 9th of March of this year. So let me put forward the government of the Netherlands as having taken a leadership position and said clearly, unequivocally, no backdoors, right? So we have a government which stood up and said, this is my Ministry of Justice, this is my Ministry of the Interior, we're agreeing backdoors is a bad idea, we're going to go out, take an international position on that, And we're even going to pump money into it to make sure that we've put our money where our mouth is. And this is the Dutch. The United States has taken a more shy approach about it, but it's actually, to be fair, the second country which has displayed some leadership. Since October, it said, we won't legislate. We won't legislate backdoors into being, for now, is the message we've been getting since October. And actually, as I understand it from my friends behind the scenes, and I would like to think that I have many in the United States, it was not an easy decision, right? There was, from what I understand, quite a lot of toing and froing between, the White House and the FBI and other agencies, with the State Department also somewhere in between, until people said, no, it's not the right way to do things. And let's face it, it's not easy being a head of state or a president or prime minister anywhere, and perhaps least of all in the United States, because you have your intelligence agencies and your law enforcement advising you to do one thing or the other, and you keep telling them, well, give me proportionality. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at the number of times where President Obama has been taken to task because he has tried to speak the word proportionality. Latest in the interview with The Atlantic, a couple of weeks ago. So we have to be fair in the way we deal with this. But the fact that we're talking about it, the fact that we're saying, yes, terrorism is a very bad thing and we're going to fight it, but is it really proportionate to, in the name of terrorism, blast everybody else's privacy out of the window? And that's the subject we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Great. Ashkan, did you want to add?
And I do think, I do appreciate the Netherlands, the Dutch approach, particularly because they've taken more of a hacking approach, a target, so they're basically finding vulnerabilities and doing the due diligence on kind of a targeted, so they're able to relieve some of the pressure placed upon them by their national security agencies by finding another approach to solving the same problem, which is how do you intercept the communication of parties, of suspected terrorists, of criminals, while not weakening the security of everyone else. And I think this is somewhere where I might play the education card, which is not educating consumers, but educating policymakers on kind of what are the trade-offs, what are the tools, what are the opportunities. So I was part of these conversations at the White House, at the FTC. I was also one of the reporters who reported on the Snowden documents for the Washington Post. I've kind of worn a few hats, and I've seen, and it's not by any means an easy debate or easy discussion, and so I do realize that or recognize that leadership is hard, but I also am not a fan of the let's not take a decision because of the particular So when that administration position came out and I was at the FTC at the time, I had huge reservations, particularly because when there's a Paris attack, when there's a San Bernardino attack, if you've not come to a policy decision in peacetime that you've identified a workable compromise, you'll rush to find a compromise in a potentially uneducated or uninformed forum to solve problems. And policy made in crisis is always the worst policy.
I agree with you completely, which is why I would put in two things on this. If you followed what President Obama said on the 11th of March, and this is where I agree with him, he said, guys, he was talking about encryption, and talking to the companies and said, unless you come up with a solution, we might be in with a sloppy one. I think sloppy is the word he used, because you'd get a rush job going through Congress, etc. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because when I'm talking about education, I'm not only talking about everybody out there and everybody who buys a smartphone, etc. I think we have a particularly difficult case in educating the policymakers, because the policymakers, at least most of those who I talk to, may be smart about a number of things, but they're certainly not smart about technology, and they're certainly not smart about the implications and the privacy implications of some technologies. And when you get down to trying to educate policymakers, we saw an attempt, if I'm not mistaken, March of last year, in the United States to tackle something called the data brokerage bill, right? Now, why is data brokerage something important in the United States? Is it going to be as big a subject in Europe as it is here? Perhaps not, because data brokerage isn't yet as big in Europe as it is here. medical data in the United States is traded on a scale which is unimaginable outside the United States. Does that mean that the people in the United States don't care about their privacy when it comes to medical data? Of course they do. Some statistics say that that is the second highest concern of some American citizens. Right. Misuse of patient information. Is it the same outside the United States? Not necessarily so, because we have a different geographical thing going on out there.
Well, it's amazing to think, sorry, but that people are worried, don't want single payer in this country because they're worried about privacy, and then we even have less of it with our fragmented, disparate system. I wanted to also, before we turn it over to the audience, Alexis, I think the sort of domestic side of the terrorism is also the predictive policing that we're seeing and that people have been sort of writing for years about. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention I teach a few classes here at SIPA. The one I'm teaching this semester is called Technology, National Security, and the Citizen. And essentially it's looking at all three of these issues as they overlap and from all three perspectives. And so a lot of my students have done tremendous work, and one of them recently presented on this, well, two things. One on smart cities. This was a student, Will Colgrove, and another student, Phil Su, mentioned that a lot of the data that's collected for smart cities could also be used for predicting where police resources should be deployed. Now, it doesn't take much time to really imagine how that could be abused in certain scenarios. If you have crime reporting that says, okay, these neighborhoods are at a particular risk, and you send a lot of police to those areas, it both targets areas where there's perhaps socioeconomic disadvantages, but there's also the potential for tweaking algorithms in such a way that you could take advantage of the absence of police in other areas. So there's a lot of well-intended uses of data collection, I think, and there's a lot of ways that it could make cities run better, make government services be more efficiently deployed, but there's also the potential for abuse with that. And this is one of the things that when you talk about algorithms and people not knowing what happens with the machine learning process, it's not just the people, like the citizens, it's also the people, the policymakers, the policy implementers. I asked one of my students, this guy Will Colgrove, who has worked for the New York City Mayor's office, when talking about smart cities and all of the possibilities, are there also the task forces that you would see, for instance, in the police that run through disaster scenarios in case, for instance, the traffic lights all went down or some other sort of vulnerability was introduced into the system? And I think the idea is that absolutely not. There's a lot of enthusiasm about what data collection can do for cities and delivering of services, but not a lot of thought about how it could go wrong. So in terms of privacy, as you said, you walk by stores and there's data collection from your phones. I don't think people realize that it's not just about commerce, it's not just about hackers, it's well-intended at times government services collecting data that might be used in some ways that they're not expecting or could go wrong in some ways.
Thank you. I see that Elaine is at the ready with the mic.
Oh, no, I'm using a handout.
Yes, exactly, which is good. And I know we have a lot of illustrious people in the audience, including, I don't know, Peter, if you wanted to weigh in at any point or now. But Elaine's got the mic, so hands up, please, if you wanted to comment or ask a question. Maybe we'll start with Peter while everyone else gathers their thoughts. Great, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, a lot of stuff I totally agree with. As far as educating users, one of the cases that comes to my mind is the recent FTC action against Verizon. Verizon was found to be using these super cookies or zombie cookies, essentially tracking users on mobile, making mobile web requests, so HTTP requests on their cell phones. Without anyone's knowledge. So, first of all, there's no opportunity to build capacity or educate users on something, to avoid something that neither they nor the government nor most other companies perhaps know is occurring on a company's networks. And it's also an instructive example because you don't have many options in the U.S., so competition plays a role to choose among carriers, even if you were educated on which is more privacy respecting or not. So I think it's just important to see that privacy is a business advantage, that companies are seeing the business case for privacy, but that there's still a role for regulatory actors to work on things like net neutrality and competition issues.
And also when your privacy is violated, you have no idea who's done it. For example, my stepdaughter is getting married next week, and I was looking for a dress, and now every time I go on the internet on any of my devices, I see dress advertisements. And I don't know how or where or when it happened, but these dresses, expensive dresses, are now chasing me all around the web. You had a question.
Just real quick, actually, so the FCC point, actually, it was the FCC, not FTC, but it raises a good point. Because it wasn't, so your ISP can track you as much as they want, right? They have access to all of your data, but historically they've refrained. Some of the ISPs are now moving into using your data with advertising partnerships, and so that was the FCC's recent privacy rules clarifying. But the example he described was this weird thing where the Verizon was tagging all the traffic that goes by with essentially kind of like an identifier, like imagine like your social security number or or your phone number. Let's say every piece of data that goes by on the network, it would write on it your phone number, so that anyone receiving it, whether it was the website you're going to or any of the third parties, could robustly identify that it was your data, right? And so what they were doing is they were essentially creating an ecosystem where others could track you based on a feature they added, and it was very kind of challenging to understand, well, who's causing the privacy harm, who's doing the privacy invasion, right, and what's the remedy? And ultimately, the FCC went after Verizon for this practice, and there was other companies involved. But it's a mixed bag. It's not just like one person observing. It's me doing something. Like if I said something that I learned about you in confidence, and I say it in this audience, right? But the person who actually writes it down and publishes it is over there. It's kind of a cascading effect. Sorry.
Very interesting. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Joseph?
Yeah, very, very quickly, just to tie in the 2 points together, when you were asking us about examples of good practice and at the same time various roles, I'd like to agree with the fact that there's also a role for the regulator, for the policymaker to intervene. And in fact, this is one of the cases where, in the same way that we ask ourselves, can we look to the United States for a good example in this area, or can we look to Europe for a good example in this area, or actually to Australia, New Zealand, or China for other examples. But in this case, I think it's worthwhile looking not only at the new data protection regulations coming out in Europe, which have been cited this morning, but also at some of the evidence-based research which is coming out there. I ran 2 projects. One was called SMART, actually, and the other was called Respect. And at the end of 8.6 million euros, I think we have a nice fat draft pan-European law on surveillance. Because there are some things which you can do using the market and using the companies, but the other you can also look at asking the question, so what are the right safeguards which need to be introduced? Are they capable of being introduced? And will we go this way? But at this moment in time, of course, we're letting the European regulators get their breath back after 4 years on working on the current set of legislation before we look at surveillance properly. But perhaps that will come up during the rest of the discussion this afternoon.
Okay, absolutely.
I'd be interested in the panel's opinion on this issue. It would be perfectly possible for the health department in the United Kingdom, by correlating some private sector and public sector databases, to identify the households where very elderly people are not heating their houses properly in the winter. Perfectly possible to do that. Those people did not give their consent to that use of their data. You can say there's a social purpose. Could you envisage an argument that would say, if there's a democratic debate, Parliament, the representatives of the people vote that this is a sensible thing to do, that, as it were, is enough? Or does one have to say, no, you have to find another way of identifying these old people at risk?
That's an excellent question.
That's very ethical, right? That's
Yeah, I mean,
Just Laura.
well, yeah, and it brings up this question. As you said, it is an ethical question. If people are truly, if their lives are at risk, if their health is at risk, does the government have the right, the responsibility, the obligation to intervene? At the same time, you can imagine if you were the person at home who liked to cuddle up with a lot of blankets, and you had someone come to your home and suggest that you were doing something improperly, people would be upset. I think that this has to do with, again, this question of not norms in the way that the panel previously was discussing, but like what is culturally acceptable. In some cultures, the right to one's person and privacy is, it trumps, it goes beyond even one's own safety. And I would suggest that in the United States, for instance, people in the US don't agree on anything except for perhaps the idea that everyone should leave them alone when it comes to doing what they want to do in their homes.
But if Singapore were cold, they would have done this 50 years ago,
Right.
I'm sure, right?
And there are exceptions too, so that's a very nuanced, subtle example. But you can think of things like disease outbreak, right, and quarantining, where people want to track that information. Another example that's kind of the reverse of private information as a public good is child molester databases, right? So in the US, they publish, you can find out where child molesters live in your neighborhood, and that's a privacy invasive topic, but it's done as a public good so that other people in the area can know and be aware. And these are all controversial. Yours is a much more subtle manner, but it is true that there's beneficial, publicly beneficial uses of disclosure. There's also publicly beneficial uses of privacy that benefit not just the individual, right? So we, like for democracy to function, you want some amounts of, some ability to vote and engage and convene privately, right? So there are a bunch of these nuances that don't necessarily impact the individual but become a public good, and I think they're important to highlight as well.
I think if I could come back to Sir David Owen's question, we also need to ask ourselves the question, is it necessary and proportionate and legitimate in a democratic society? And I think that you might get nuanced responses even depending on the society you are in. I mean, you might get quite different responses if you ask the question in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Scandinavia, for example.
Germany.
And then you ask exactly the same question in Italy or Croatia or Slovenia or Romania, where history has influenced the public debate in different directions. So clearly, there are some states, and in some of the research we've run, we found that people in the Respect Project, for example, we found people in the UK tend to trust the government much more, rightly or wrongly, we don't go there, than some people in many other European states. And therefore, what I'm leading to is that perhaps the right thing to do then is to make sure that the decision is not taken by some nameless and faceless bureaucrat, but it's taken as a conscious decision after a public policy debate in which people can influence their representatives, in which people can be informed and where they can inform the debate. And I think that as a result of that, you'd see a much healthier approach, because you mentioned the NHS, Sir David. As you know, the computerization of the NHS, the use of data by the NHS has been one of the most debated and least debated subjects on the planet, right? One of the most expensive computer projects ever in the world, and at the same time, where is it going? What are the private uses of such data? Whereas over here in the United States, as I understand it, the minute that I'm in a pharmacy, I haven't even left the pharmacy and my data is already being traded and resold. Now, at what stage can we use consent? Because one of the funny things about this is few people know it, but we actually have the technology to enable the citizen to consent. But it's only being proposed, as I understand it, if I understand correctly, to enable medical practitioners to use that technology to indicate consent. But the poor citizen out there whose data it is, are we offering them the option or thinking about offering them the option if they have true and informed consent? So the discussion about medical data and the use of other data, including heating data, consumption data, is also linked to a much wider debate. And that's the debate about smart meters, for example. You can actually tell if you have smart meters installed who is using electricity or not. But you can tell a whole load of other things, and it's also a risk from another point of view. If you start deciding, instead of bombing places, why don't you shut down the smart meters and make everybody's fridges shut down, and that way we're going to create a shortage of food. So there are many, many dimensions to the debate which make it very interesting, but necessarily complex.
Good. Other questions from the floor? We still have a bit. I think we have a little bit more time. Oh, I was told we could run over. Is that true? But anyway, if there aren't any questions, we won't run over. But there must be a question somewhere. Or comment?
To say Will Colgrove works for Gail Brewer, not Matt.
I'm sorry?
Will Colgrove works for Gail Brewer, not Matt.
Oh, sorry, and I didn't mean to suggest that this was something he was attributing to a particular office. This was a research project, but yes, thank you for the clarification. One of the reasons I brought up that example of my class is that, and this is something I mentioned at the my first comment, is as it has become such a complex issue, as Sir David mentioned, their data exists and maybe exists, and good things could come from it. Government could save lives, but there's also this question of what an individual feels comfortable with. One person might feel comfortable with their health records being shared. Another person might feel that it subjects them to potential discrimination in some way. So it's a giant, complex sphere to investigate, and we need to look at it from multiple angles. And that's one of the reasons why it's so great to have these kinds of conferences, so that we have people from the private sector, from government, and journalists, advocates, et cetera, to look at all these different pieces.
And I'm feeling a bit more cheered up than I was half an hour ago, because clearly you're both saying that there are moves by companies and starting to be some good sort of regulatory and legislative ideas that we could look at, even though necessarily, as you say, they're not going to be probably adapted. It sounds like it's going to be very hard to get global norms on this, or global standards.